March 6, 1944, 23,000 feet above the snow-dusted farmlands of southern Germany. The air is so cold it burns, minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, inside the unheated tail turret of a B-17 Flying Fortress. Frost feathers the plexiglass. Every breath fogs, then freezes. Outside, the roar of 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines drowns thought, but not fear. Inside the cramped steel cocoon, Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan grips twin 50 caliber machine guns. His knuckles are raw, his oxygen mask fogged at the edges. He scans the horizon, eyes narrowed against glare and fatigue. And then he sees them. 12 black specks, sharp and fast, arcing out of the sun. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, closing fast. Standard procedure demands he wait. Wait for them to commit. Wait for them to enter his killing zone. Conserve ammunition. Defend. Survive. But Donovan doesn't wait. He swings his turret, thumbs the triggers, and unleashes a stream of tracers into the void. 2,000 yards out, far beyond effective range. Not to kill, to terrify. In that moment, high over enemy territory, with ice on his eyelashes and 2,000 rounds between him and annihilation. One man rewrites the rules of aerial combat. The sky will never be the same. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal crescendo. The United States Army Air Forces clung to a doctrine forged in pre-war theory and tested in blood: daylight precision bombing. Unlike the British Royal Air Force, which carpet-bombed German cities by night, the Americans believed they could surgically dismantle the Nazi war machine, targeting ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, by striking in daylight with heavily armed, self-defending bomber formations. The weapon of choice was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. With its rugged airframe, redundant systems, and 10 50 caliber machine guns, it was designed to fly in tight defensive combat boxes, overlapping fields of fire, creating a lethal sphere around the formation. The theory was sound, the reality was slaughter. Throughout 1943, unescorted B-17 missions deep into Germany met catastrophic losses. In August, during the second raid on Schweinfurt, the Black Thursday mission, 60 of 291 bombers were shot down. Another 138 were damaged. Over 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The attrition rate was unsustainable. German fighters, flying in coordinated waves from multiple directions, exploited gaps in the bomber boxes. They struck from angles where defensive fire was weakest, high and behind, low and astern, the dreaded 6 o'clock high. The Luftwaffe had refined its tactics. Using ground-controlled interception, radar-directed fighter relays, and aggressive mass attacks, German pilots learned to swarm bomber streams like wolves. They led with experienced Jagdgeschwader pilots in Bf 109Gs and Focke-Wulf 190As, fast, heavily armed, and deadly at high altitude. Their strategy wasn't just to shoot down bombers, it was to break formations. Once a B-17 fell out of the protective box, it was finished. By winter 1943-44, the 8th Air Force faced a crisis. Morale plummeted. Crews rotated through missions on a grim countdown. 25 sorties to complete a tour. Few made it. The tail gunner position, exposed at the very end of the aircraft, bore the brunt. Facing direct stern attacks with limited traverse, poor visibility, and no armor, tail gunners suffered the highest casualty rate in the bomber, nearly 40%. Many didn't survive their 5th mission. Yet change was coming. In late 1943, the P-51B Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, began escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. But on March 6, 1944, on the raid against the Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg, many formations still flew without full fighter cover in the deepest penetration zones. For those crews, Survival depended not just on armor or altitude, but on the mindset of the men behind the guns. And in one B-17 named Hell's Fury, that mindset was about to shift from defense to defiance. Inside the 8th Air Force, air gunnery was taught as a science of restraint. Manuals emphasized discipline. Hold your fire until the enemy is within 400 to 600 yards. Aim for the cockpit or engine. Use short bursts. Conserve ammunition. The logic was simple. Each B-17 carried a finite supply, typically 2,000 rounds for the tail turret. A gunner might face 3 or 4 fighter waves on a single mission. Waste ammo early and you'd be defenseless when the final desperate attack came. This doctrine assumed the enemy dictated the terms of engagement. The fighter would choose when, where, and how to strike. The gunner's role was reactive: observe, track, and respond. Training films from gunnery schools in Texas and Florida reinforced this passivity. Students practiced tracking drone targets on fixed paths, learning to lead and squeeze, not to anticipate, disrupt, or dominate. But the battlefield told a different story. Interviews with returning crews revealed a pattern. German pilots respected aggression. When a bomber's guns opened fire early, tracers arcing into the distance, it often caused attackers to waver, break formation, or abort. Yet such behavior was discouraged. Gunnery instructors labeled it wasteful or reckless. The system punished initiative. The human cost mounted. By March 1944, over 10,000 USAF airmen had been killed in the European theater. In the 390th Bombardment Group alone, based at Framlingham, England, tail gunner turnover was constant. Some crews flew with substitutes pulled from ground units. Morale in the tail turret was grim. Many gunners described it as flying in a coffin with a view. Yet within this crucible, a new philosophy began to stir, not from headquarters, but from the men who lived in the ice and noise of the rear fuselage. Some, like Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, questioned the dogma. Why wait to be attacked? Why let the enemy control the rhythm of combat? If a burst of fire at 1,500 yards could break up an entire formation, wasn't that more efficient than waiting to shoot one fighter at 400? Donovan wasn't the only one thinking this way, but he was the first to act on it with such relentless, systematic intensity. Trained not in military orthodoxy but in the survival instincts of South Boston alleyways, he saw air combat not as a defensive exercise but as a contest of wills. And in war, he believed the first man to flinch lost. This tension, between doctrine and desperation, between conservation and control, set the stage for what happened over Germany on March 6, 1944. A single mission, a single gunner, and a tactical heresy that would soon become standard practice. The old rules were about to be tested and shattered. From the very back of a B-17, Michael Donovan didn't come from the officer class or the aviation elite. Born in 1921 in South Boston, he grew up in a neighborhood where toughness was currency and hesitation meant pain. His father worked the docks. His older brother boxed in the Golden Gloves. Donovan learned early that survival belonged to those who struck first. By 17, he'd been in over 30 street fights. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he enlisted immediately, not for glory, but because it was the next fight. The Army Air Forces wanted him for ground crew. He insisted on gunnery school. There, instructors noted his unorthodox aggression. He fired before targets entered the ideal zone, prioritized speed over precision, and never flinched under simulated attack. His mantra, "Dead gunners don't shoot back," was dismissed as bravado. Yet it reflected a cold calculus in aerial combat. Hesitation was fatal. His mindset wasn't recklessness. It was preemptive survival. The Luftwaffe's fighter tactics in early 1944 were lethally refined. Operating under the Gefechtsverband system, Bf-109s and FW-190s attacked in coordinated staffline of 12 to 18 aircraft. The standard approach was a stern quarter dive from 6 o'clock high, positioning above and behind the bomber stream to exploit blind spots. The lead fighter would draw defensive fire, while wingmen, flying disciplined echelon patterns, strafed the fuselage or dropped 20mm cannon rounds into engines and fuel tanks. Timing was everything. Pilots trained to compress their attack into a 10-second window. Close fast, fire, break away before return fire could adjust. This method had decimated American formations throughout 1943. What made it effective wasn't just firepower, it was predictability. German pilots expected bomber gunners to react, not initiate. The B-17G, the definitive wartime variant, mounted a Cheyenne tail turret, 2.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in a fully enclosed, power-assisted mount. It offered 90 degrees of horizontal traverse and 60 degrees of elevation, enough to cover the stern ankh, but blind to low or beam attacks. Each gun fed from 500-round ammunition boxes, totaling 2,000 rounds. Ballistically, the 50 cal was lethal to 1,000 yards, with tracer visibility up to 2,000, but hitting a maneuvering fighter beyond 800 yards was largely luck. Standard doctrine treated the tail turret as a last line of defense, yet Donovan saw it differently. Not as a shield, but as a psychological weapon. The tracers didn't need to kill at extreme range, they needed to disrupt. And the turret's greatest advantage wasn't firepower, it was visibility. From the tail, Donovan saw the entire sky behind the bomber. He saw formations coalesce before anyone else. That gave him time and initiative. These three elements, Donovan's psychology, German tactical rigidity, and the tail turret's overlooked potential, converged over Germany. Not by design, but by necessity. In a war where seconds decided life or death, one man chose to act before the enemy could. Not all innovations survive bureaucracy, but Donovan's defiance found fertile ground in two key leaders. Captain James Whitmore, pilot of Hell's Fury, was a pragmatist. He knew his crew's survival odds were grim, especially in the tail. When Donovan requested permission to shoot early and often, Whitmore didn't dismiss him. He weighed the risk. Wasted ammo versus disrupted attacks. His decision, "You've got one mission to prove it," wasn't just trust. It was adaptive leadership under fire. Higher up, Major General Frederick Anderson, commander of the 8th Air Force's 1st Bombardment Division, recognized the broader implications. After March 6th, he didn't bury the report in red tape. He summoned Donovan personally, authorized a training program within days, and fast-tracked doctrinal change. In an organization often criticized for rigidity, this responsiveness was rare and critical. Without Whitmore's on-the-spot gamble and Anderson's institutional backing, the Donovan Doctrine might have died as a footnote. Donovan's greatest breakthrough wasn't mechanical, it was mental. He understood that aerial combat was as much about perception as ballistics. A bomber with an aggressive tail gunner didn't just defend, it projected danger. German pilots, trained to assess risk, quickly learned that certain B-17s were hot. Radio intercepts from March and April 1944 showed German squadron leaders warning, "Avoid stern approaches on fortress with active tail fire." One Luftwaffe after-action report noted, American gunners now fire during approach phase, morale effect severe. By the summer of 1944, German pilots began selecting softer targets, bombers with passive gunners, avoiding formations known for early sustained fire. This shift meant that aggression didn't just kill fighters, it deterred them. And deterrence saved bombers. Donovan weaponized fear, not through cruelty, but through consistency. His empty guns at the end of the Augsburg mission still fired because the enemy believed they could. USAAF Field Manual FM 115, Air Gunnery, published in 1943, taught gunners to wait until the target is in the sight before firing. It warned against wasteful expenditure and emphasized controlled, deliberate fire. This reflected pre-war assumptions that bombers would fly in perfect boxes, that fighters would attack one at a time, and that ammunition conservation was paramount. But real combat was chaotic. Formations broke. Fighters came in swarms, and waiting meant death. Donovan's method flipped the script: initiate, disrupt, dominate. His doctrine accepted higher ammo use per engagement, but reduced total engagements by breaking up attacks before they began. This wasn't disobedience, it was battlefield adaptation. The Army eventually recognized that. By June 1944, revised gunnery bulletins began emphasizing early engagement and psychological suppression. The manual hadn't changed, but the war had. These angles reveal a truth often overlooked in military history. Transformation rarely comes from technology alone. It emerges from the collision of personality, pressure, and leadership, and the courage to discard dogma when lives depend on it. The stage was set. Doctrine had met reality. Now it would be tested in fire. March 6, 1944. Mission number 37 for the 390th Bombardment Group. Target: the Messerschmitt aircraft factory in Augsburg, southern Germany, a critical node in the Luftwaffe's fighter production. Intelligence estimated 250 German interceptors would rise to meet the 800-plane Allied armada. For the crews of the 8th Air Force, this was deep penetration, 500 miles into enemy territory, far beyond the range of most P-51 escorts. Survival would depend on formation integrity, defensive fire, and luck. Hell's Fury, B-17G, serial number 4231909, took off from RAF Framlingham at 0647 hours. Assigned to the low squadron of the 390th Bomberstream, it carried a full load of 2,000 rounds in the tail turret and a crew of 10, among them Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, seated in the frozen rear. Oxygen mask strapped tight, gloves taped to the grip. He briefed his plan to Captain Whitmore on the tarmac. "I'm not waiting for them to shoot first." Whitmore had nodded. "Just keep us alive." The formation crossed the English Channel at 0800, climbed to 23,000 feet over the North Sea, and entered German airspace near Aachen at 0824. Flak peppered the skies over the Rhine, but the real threat lay ahead. At 9:19, the radio crackled. "Bandits, 6 o'clock high, 12 o'clock high." Donovan swiveled his turret. 12 Bf-109s, silhouetted against the morning sun, were forming up 2,000 yards astern. Classic Gefechtsverband configuration. Lead aircraft at the apex, wingmen staggered in echelon, closing at 300 miles per hour. Standard procedure dictated silence until they reached 800 yards. Donovan did not wait. At 0920, he opened fire, a long, deliberate burst of 200 rounds. Tracers arced through the thin air, streaking far ahead of the fighters. Most rounds fell harmlessly into the void. But the effect was immediate. The German formation stuttered. The lead pilot, expecting defensive fire only upon commitment, saw tracers slicing through his approach path. Instinct overrode training. He broke right. His wingmen, thrown off by the sudden disruption, scattered to avoid collision. The coordinated attack dissolved before it began. "Donovan, cease fire. You're burning ammo," Whitmore's voice snapped over the intercom. "Negative, sir. Watch what happens next." And it did. The Bf-109s regrouped, but now they approached cautiously, probing, no longer diving with confidence. The initiative had shifted. For the first time in the air war over Europe, the attacker was reacting to the defender. Donovan reloaded, checked his ammo. 1,800 rounds remaining. The mission had just begun, and the Germans were already learning a new rule. Don't give the tail gunner time to think. He'll take it from you. But the Luftwaffe would not yield easily. Within minutes, a second wave, 18 fighters strong, was already vectoring in. This time they came with fury. 15 minutes after the first engagement, radar operators aboard Hell's Fury detected a new formation, this time 18 aircraft, a full Gruppe, weaving through contrails at 25,000 feet. They'd heard the radio chatter. They knew about the lone B-17 with the mad tail gunner, and they came prepared, Not in one wave, but in a pincer from 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 7 o'clock, every stern quarter covered. It was overwhelming force designed to saturate defensive arcs. Standard response would have been to tighten formation, call for help, and hope waist and ball turret gunners could cover flanks while the tail held the center. But Hell's Fury had drifted slightly during the first fight. The nearest friendly bomber was 3 miles away. No P-51s were in range. They were alone. Donovan made a ruthless calculation. He ignored the threats from 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock, trusting Sergeants Price and Johnson in the waist guns to handle them. He focused everything on the 6 Bf-109s diving straight down the tailpipe from 6 o'clock. At 1,200 yards, he opened up, not on the lead, but on the second fighter, the wingman. The German flying rigid formation never saw it coming. A 150-round burst shredded his port wing. The aircraft cartwheeled into smoke and flame. The lead, suddenly exposed, broke off. The entire attack faltered. But the Luftwaffe adapted. Minutes later, a third wave appeared, 36 fighters, reinforced by FW-190s, joining the 12 still shadowing from earlier. 48 enemy aircraft now circled like sharks. Intelligence later confirmed this was one of the largest concentrated fighter responses of the war against a single bomber. The odds were 20-1. Donovan had 380 rounds left. He didn't hesitate. At 2,000 yards, he unleashed a sustained barrage, not aiming at planes, but at the space between them. Tracers crisscrossed the formation's heart. One Bf-109 clipped another in evasive maneuvers. Both spiraled down. A third caught fire from near misses. The formation shattered into chaos. German pilots, trained for discipline, now flew evasively. Individuals, not a unit. Still, they came. A final swarm of 12 dove in tight, low and fast, 6 o'clock low, the blind spot of the Cheyenne turret. Donovan's guns were dry. He had fired his last round, but he kept tracking the lead fighter. He moved his turret smoothly, barrels aligned with the cockpit, fingers resting on the triggers. The German pilot saw it, saw the twin 50 cals locked on him. At 200 yards, point-blank range, he banked violently right, breaking off. The entire swarm followed, not because the guns fired, but because they might. The psychological threshold had been crossed. Empty barrels carried more weight than live ones ever could. Hell's Fury pressed on to Augsburg, dropped its bombs on target, and turned for home. Over the next 3 hours, 3 more German fighter groups sighted the bomber, but none engaged. Word had spread on Luftwaffe frequencies. Avoid B-17 with aggressive tailfire, extreme losses. At 16:47 hours, the bomber touched down at Framlingham. Ground crews counted 47 bullet holes, shrapnel scars from 13 cannon strikes, and a cracked rudder. But the crew was intact. Donovan climbed out, hands steady, and lit a cigarette. In just over 4 minutes of sustained combat, he had fired all 2,000 rounds and changed the course of aerial warfare. The proof lay not just in the wreckage falling behind them, but in the stunned silence of German radio channels. The tail gunner had become the hunter, and the 8th Air Force was watching. The debriefing began before the engines cooled. Captain Whitmore filed an immediate action report. Tail gunner engaged enemy at extreme range, disrupted all coordinated attacks. No damage to tail section during final approaches. Ground crews verified battle damage. 13 cannon hits, mostly along the fuselage and wings, but none in the tail gun position itself during the last wave. That alone was anomalous. Normally, the tail absorbed the brunt of stern attacks. Verification came from multiple sources. Radio intercepts by the 8th Air Force's Y service revealed frantic German transmissions during and after the mission. One Luftwaffe squadron leader radioed, "Heavy losses to 1 fortress. Repeat, 1 fortress. Do not attack from stern." Another message, decoded on March 7th, read, "American tail gunner employs new tactic. Fires during formation phase. Causes disorientation. Recommend avoidance." Then came the kill count, Using gun camera footage from nearby bombers, witness statements from the waist and ball turret gunners, and post-mission intelligence cross-referenced with Luftwaffe loss records, the 390th Bomb Group confirmed 12 enemy aircraft destroyed, 4 probable, 3 damaged, all attributed to the tail turret of Hell's Fury. It was the highest single-position kill tally in the history of the 8th Air Force. By March 8, Major General Frederick Anderson had dispatched an intelligence officer to Framlingham. Within 48 hours, Donovan was summoned to 1st Bombardment Division headquarters at Brampton Grange. There, he demonstrated his method using chalk and a blackboard. Don't wait for them to decide when to shoot. Decide for them. Anderson, a veteran of the Schweinfurt raids, recognized the strategic implication. On March 12, he issued a classified directive. Establish experimental gunnery training program under Sergeant M. Donovan. Focus: early engagement. Psychological suppression, sector dominance. The Donovan Doctrine was born. The first class began on March 20, 1944, at a converted hangar near RAF Bury St. Edmunds. 30 tail gunners, volunteers with combat experience, underwent 2 weeks of intensive training. They practiced tracking simulated fighters at 1,500 yards, learned to walk tracers through formation centers, and studied Luftwaffe approach patterns. Most importantly, they were taught to think offensively. As Donovan told them, your job isn't to survive your position. It's to make the enemy regret flying near it. The results were swift. By May 1944, 120 gunners had completed the course. In missions over Berlin, Brunswick, and Regensburg, bomber groups employing Donovan-style tail gunners reported a 60% reduction in successful stern attacks. Tail gunner casualties, which had hovered near 38% in January, dropped to 29% by April and 23% by June. The data was undeniable. Aggression, when disciplined, saved lives. But the true test came not in American reports, but in German ones. Captured Luftwaffe documents confirmed what Allied intelligence suspected. In a May 1944 tactical bulletin issued by JOG Division 3, German fighter commanders explicitly warned, American B-17s now employ aggressive tail gunners who fire during approach. This disrupts formation integrity and increases vulnerability to collision. Avoid direct stern attacks. Prefer high-angle dives from 11 or 1. But adapting proved difficult. High-angle attacks required more altitude, longer setup time, and exposed fighters to top turret and nose gunners. Positions also beginning to adopt Donovan-style tactics. Worse, decentralized attacks reduced the swarm's lethality. Without coordinated pressure, bomber boxes held firm. Donovan himself trained over 300 gunners by August 1944. Graduates of his program went on to become aces in their own right. Sergeant Thomas Bailey, a Donovan protege, downed 16 fighters in 3 months. Others never fired a shot, but their mere reputation caused German pilots to veer away. The doctrine spread beyond the tail turret. Ball, waist, and top gunners adopted early engagement principles. By late 1944, the entire B-17 defensive system operated on Donovan's core idea: seize the initiative, even in defense. After the war, the concept endured. The U.S. Air Force incorporated aggressive defensive fire into Cold War bomber doctrine. NATO gunnery manuals in the 1950s cited the Donovan Doctrine as a foundational case study in psychological deterrence. Even modern air defense systems, like the Phalanx CIWS on naval vessels, embody his principle: detect, disrupt, and dominate before the threat reaches its optimal firing position. Yet Donovan never sought credit. He left the military in 1945, returned to Boston, and worked construction for 40 years. When historians tracked him down in the 1970s, he deflected praise. I just did what kept my crew alive. The real heroes are the ones who flew back with holes in their wings. His humility obscured a seismic truth. In a war defined by machines, it was a single man's mindset that altered the balance of the sky. And though his name faded from public memory, his doctrine flew on, in every bomber that made it home because the enemy turned away. That deterrence begins before the first shot is fired, and that courage sometimes looks less like bravery and more like refusing to wait for death to decide when to come. Donovan died in 1998, largely unknown outside veteran circles. His funeral was small, no honor guard, no fanfare. Just a few old gunners raising a glass in a South Boston bar, whispering, "He taught us to shoot first." But in the archives of air warfare, in declassified Luftwaffe reports, in 8th Air Force after-action reviews, in the training syllabi of modern air forces, his fingerprint remains. March 6, 1944, lasted 4 minutes. In that span, one man proved that the most powerful weapon in the sky wasn't the .50 caliber machine gun. It was the will to fire it before fear could take hold.